So, welcome to the fourth lesson of Decisions of Fate, navigating medical ethics from the Jewish perspective, from the Jewish tradition. Tonight, we will focus on, as the name suggests, a body's dignity, the dignity of the human body following the passing of an individual. And we'll begin with a case study. We don't have a video for this case study, but it's a case study nonetheless. It's on page 118 if you have the student book. The case study, I'm not going to read through the entirety of it, but the case study is the idea of unclaimed bodies, which unfortunately in the world we live in, it happens. It happens in ancient times as well, but it's a little more surprising that it happens nowadays. But there is this idea where there are unclaimed bodies, whether they're found by the coroners, whether they're found in hospitals, whether they're found in the park or wherever else they may be located. There are unclaimed bodies, and what happens with those bodies? And unfortunately, or fortunately, as it's that's the idea of the case study. We'll see as we get along. What happens to these unclaimed cadavers? And as this case study presents in the second paragraph, about 1 in 4 cadavers belong to those the county calls unclaimed. People whose family cannot afford the body, cannot afford or choose not to provide funeral services, or next of kin can't be found. And there is a program which saves, in this case, Tarrant County in Texas, thousands of dollars by hundreds of thousands of dollars by using these cadavers for medical study. They're brought to the Health Science Center, and they're used for medical studies. And the obvious ethical question that's raised is, should that be done? Not even getting into it, voluntary. Here we're talking about involuntary. There are cadavers that were found. There's next of kin cannot be reached, or the next of kin doesn't want to be bothered for whatever reason, or can't be bothered. What happens to these cadavers? And here in this situation, in many cases, it's not the only situation. This is just a case study where they're being used for medical study. And the question is, from an ethical point of view, is that correct? And a few responses are brought here. And really the concerns are both philosophical and practical. If we look in the about halfway through, we have a discussion from a volunteer at a hospice in Arlington. His name is Eli Shoup. And sorry, her name is Eli Shoup. And she has concerns with this program. Her concerns with the program are both philosophical and practical. She mulled over the consent or lack thereof. People have a right to make decisions about their bodies while they're alive, she said. A deep philosophical question to ask is, does that right persist after we die? For Shoup, the answer is yes. In December, she published a column in the Dallas Morning News critiquing the program. She didn't want to solely offer criticism, so she signed up to one day donate her body to the Health Science Center's program. And the consent forms abounded. If they think it's important for me to sign all these consents, clearly they think the fact that I'm making this unpressured, autonomous decision to give my body to them is important, she said. So why do they not need these consents for someone who just happened to have nothing when they died? And the reality is the article goes on to say that there are alternatives. In New York in 2016, New York banned the use of unclaimed bodies as cadavers for medical studies. The state's medical school said they would fill in any gaps by expanding their programs for private donations, etc. And so the question really is, the unclaimed cadavers, is that something that is a program that should be continued or not? From a medical ethic perspective, or really ethical perspective, not just medical ethics, but an ethical perspective, should these unwanted or for whatever reason unclaimed cadavers be used as cadavers in the medical study program, or should they be given proper burial and proper dignity? And that's really the case study that we will base our discussion on. We'll begin with this story, and I'm sure we have different opinions on that, as there are in every single issue, especially as it comes to ethical issues. Should unclaimed bodies be allowed for use for anatomical dissection? Now, there are various claims for and against this situation. There are those that argue for this program because they say unclaimed bodies are a burden on the public purse, and they alleviate the shortage of cadavers for research and study. And the research and study is something beneficial, so it saves the society. It saves society money. It saves society the trouble of dealing with them. And on the contrary, it helps society by helping medical professionals deal with studying how to figure out the body better, studying how to figure out medical ethics better and some medical procedures better, and figure out and train new medical professionals. And there are those that argue against it because clearly it's unethical to use a body without consent, just as if someone were to voluntarily give their body, they need to sign forms, they need to agree to it. So clearly we do put a strong emphasis on consent, even in these areas. And here there's a nuance to it, and that is the poor are being exploited for the benefit of society. The reality is most of these dead bodies that are left unclaimed are from underserved communities. They're from the poor. They're from those who don't do well for whatever reason. And this program seems to be exploiting the poor for the benefit of society. And so there are arguments for, arguments against, and we will circle back to this discussion of what we think Torah says about that once we get to the sources from a Torah perspective. So let's get into the Torah perspective. What does Judaism say about a person's body after their passing? One common area where this becomes a very practical discussion is an autopsy. An autopsy has become a regular form of postmortem analyzation, postmortem dissection to determine the disease, to determine the cause of death, for various other reasons of study. We're not even going to get into medical science. It's another question perhaps we'll touch on later, but here we're just discussing an autopsy for the purpose of an autopsy. Is that permitted according to Jewish law or not? And so we'll begin with an early source, a source in the Talmud that discusses autopsy, or perhaps we can glean some laws pertaining to autopsy from this text. Let's have a look on page 123, text 1. Talmud says as follows: one who transports human bones on a donkey may not place them in a leather saddlebag or ride on top of them, for by doing so, one treats them disrespectfully. Now, why this individual is transporting human bones is a discussion for another time. It is discussed by the commentaries of the Talmud, what is going on here. But be it as it may, one who is transporting human bones for whatever reason, they have to treat the human remains with respect. And the question is why? What is the rationale for or against acting disrespectfully toward human remains? Right? On the one hand, they seem to be inanimate objects. Granted, they used to be a human, but perhaps, what's the rationale for needing to treat them respectfully? And generally speaking, there are 2 points of rationale that the sages in the commentary discuss. The first one is a person has an interest in how their remains are handled. Just as one should not abuse someone who is alive, one should not abuse someone who is dead. And a person has an interest in how their remains are handled. But then there is a second, more spiritual rationale. And that is, corpse is a sacred entity. According to tradition, according to Jewish tradition, a corpse is a sacred entity, and therefore it shall not be mistreated. We're going to get back to that a little bit later on. But however one understands it, the Talmud tells us here in this passage that it is called a bizayon. It's disrespectful. And as a result, it's forbidden to ride on top of human bones or to place them in a leather satchel on the side of the donkey because it is disrespectful. If it's disrespectful on how we transport human remains, how much more so is it disrespectful to cut into and dissect a human cadaver? And so, generally speaking, the Talmud tells us that it is forbidden to cut into, to examine a human cadaver. It has to be treated with respect. But as we discussed in the prior lessons, the obvious question, especially as it pertains to medical ethics, is, are there any exceptions when it comes to a legitimate cause? And both those points are demanding for qualifications, because what exceptions and what's considered a legitimate cause? And that's what we are going to discuss today. They say there are three types of people: those who could count and those who can't. So this is what we're going to be discussing today. Two Jews, three opinions. We will get into the nitty-gritty of these opinions. The first opinion we will present is, and once again, these opinions are not opinions that these sages made out of thin air. We'll see how the rabbis left no stone unturned. They're going through the pros and cons, the benefits and the doubts that they have on each one of these Talmudic passages and early laws and early statements, and analyzing it in parallels within modern medicine as it was developing. And so the idea really was, and is till today, where rabbis don't leave anything unturned, and they analyze it from every single angle, whether it's the social angle, whether it's the legal angle, the ethical angle. And the idea really is to present something based on Jewish law and Jewish tradition. And so tonight we're going to begin with the opinion of a great early 19th century sage. His name was Rabbi Yaakov Ettlinger. He was a German halachic authority. He's perhaps most famous for one of his publications, one of his books that he authored. It's a commentary on the Talmud. It's quite popular. I studied it when I learned in yeshiva. As well as he, for those who are familiar with Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch, the great German rabbi, he was Rabbi Hirsch's teacher and mentor. And so Rabbi Ettlinger says as follows. He was asked, and it's a situation that we came across a number of times, this concept of responsa in Jewish law, which is really precedent as it pertains to legal law as well, modern secular law, the concept of precedent. And so responsa is quite common in Jewish law. And so we're quoting here from his responsa, where a question was posed to him, and seemingly it's this exact question. Let's have a look in text 2 on page 124. He's responding to a query. I was consulted regarding the case of a patient who was ill with a unique disease. The doctors treated him, but to no avail. He died of his illness. Another patient suffered from the same illness, and the doctors sought to dissect the body of the deceased person to understand the disease and possibly find a cure for the patient who is still alive. Under such circumstances, is it permissible to desecrate the dead? So what's going on here? Classic case of an autopsy, and for a legitimate cause. We're not just dissecting, and perhaps when I say here legitimate cause, I mean a cause which seems to be more pressing. We're not just dissecting a body for medical students to understand how the human anatomy and human system works, and to show them images of the organs, etc., examples. But perhaps that may be legitimate as well. I'm not saying not, but clearly that's a little less legitimate than this situation. We're less pressing, I should say, where there's one patient who's suffering from the exact disease, and the doctors want to perform an autopsy on this first patient to see if there's any way they can heal patient number 2. And as you see from the question, the questioner and the rabbi is assuming that cutting into a corpse is forbidden. It's an act of desecration, and as such, it's forbidden. Right? And they need to be handled with respect. And as such, the questioner wants to know, is this a case which is an exception to the rule that perhaps over here it may be permitted to perform an autopsy. As one will assume, the first step Rabbi Ettlinger takes in his responsa is citing the famous Talmudic passage that nothing stands in the way of saving a life, pikuach nefesh, except for the three cardinal sins: idolatry, forbidden sexual relations, and murder. And accordingly, Rabbi Ettlinger says, perhaps in this case, we can say that this is, even though we're prohibited from dissecting a cadaver because it is desecration. Desecration is not one of the three cardinal sins. And because we're talking about saving a life, obviously we can push away, so to speak, this law of respect for the deceased in order to save the life of the individual before us. Yet, Rabbi Ettlinger does not stop. And he says that we cannot blindly apply that rule of nothing stands in the way of saving a life. And he brings an interesting quote from an early sage. The quote is as follows. Text 3, page 125. It's also right here on the screen. Nothing stands in the way of saving a life. Nevertheless, if people are in mortal danger and must steal from their fellows in order to save their lives, it is forbidden for them to do so without intention to pay. One of the early sages, decisors of Jewish law, in his code of Jewish law, the Torah, as he's known by the name of his book that he printed, this is a 13th century sage, Rabbi Yaakov, the son of Asher. He writes that when it comes to saving a life, we can't just steal. We have to be able to reimburse. So if we go ahead and we steal to save a life, we can do that. Why? Because we can transgress any law except for the three cardinal sins in order to save a life. Yet, he says, there's one caveat, and that is, one may only do so if he has the intention of repaying. So say, for example, there are people running, they're about to die. God forbid they haven't eaten for however many days, and they're inches away from death. And suddenly they see a store where there's food outside. They don't have money to pay for it. Are they allowed to grab that food, right? Obviously, we're not talking about, in real time, these people are probably not making those calculations. But the question is, from a legal perspective, are they permitted to do that? And the Torah says, yes, they're permitted to do that only if they intend to repay. Why would that be? Perhaps there are two possible perspectives of looking at it. Why insist on reimbursements when the theft can save a life? And seemingly, all the Torah would be pushed away except for the three cardinal sins. The Torah tells us that we push everything away to save a life. So why insist on reimbursement? Number one can be because one cannot save their own life by hurting someone else. And so if someone steals without intending to repay, he's hurting an innocent other. And we can't hurt an innocent other. Granted, different levels of hurting, right? We're saving our hurt because a person's about to die versus taking a few apples or cans of tuna. Probably not the same level of hurting, but yet it's hurting nonetheless. And as such, in such a situation, a person can steal only if they intend to reimburse. Option B is when violating a rule, we take the minimalist route. No problem. You got to steal to save your life? Steal. Go ahead. But nowhere does it say that once you didn't die, now you don't have to repay. Why not? Now it's not about saving a life. Now you're fine. You got to repay. You can't perform another sin by not repaying. So in other words, yes, we can break rules, but break the minimum amount of rules. So God forbid, it's Shabbos. We're not allowed to drive in a car. We're not allowed to turn on lights. We're not allowed to turn on radio. We're not allowed to, right? There are a list of things that we shouldn't do on Shabbos. And God forbid someone is in mortal danger and has to be rushed to the hospital. Right? So the whatever this The dad takes the child, jumps into a car, and starts driving to the hospital. Following option B, the idea would be, you got to drive to the hospital, but don't turn on the light. It's not necessary to turn on the light. Don't turn on the radio while you're driving to the hospital, because that is an additional sin. Take the minimalist route. You're violating a rule. Go ahead and violate it, because the Torah says that's not even a violation. That's fulfilling the mitzvahs by keeping someone alive, but do it the least possible. How does that turn back, getting to Rabbi Ettlinger's question of, is an autopsy permitted in such a case? Rabbi Ettlinger says as follows. The rule is that we may violate all the laws of Torah in order to save a life, except for the 3 cardinal sins. That rule is derived from the verse that says, keep my decrees and laws, keep my decrees and laws, which a person shall obey and live by them. Live by them. Right? So the sages say we should keep the laws and live by them. The Torah is telling us that we have to live by them, which means that if, God forbid, there's a conflict between life and law, life prevails. However, Rabbi Ettlinger says, and here's a little Talmudic study. Rabbi Ettlinger says, what does the verse say? The verse says, my decrees and my laws. What does that mean? He takes that to mean, my decrees and my laws means the laws that are between man and God. If, however, violating a mitzvah will hurt a fellow man, this verse does not apply. And if this verse does not apply, then we have no basis to transgress a law between man and fellow man to save a life, because we only have that rule from the Torah, and the Torah says, my laws and decrees, and it's referencing specifically laws between man and God, so the laws of Shabbos, the laws of kosher, etc. But between man and fellow man, stealing is not permitted, unless, says Rabbi Ettlinger, if you intend to repay them, because then you're not harming the victim. If you're not harming the victim, then you can go ahead and steal and then repay. But if someone has no intention to repay, then he has no right to save his life through theft. You got that? The allowance for breaking the laws of the Torah, says Rabbi Ettlinger, is only if it's laws that are between man and God. But if it's laws between man and fellow man, we cannot hurt another fellow. And so if someone's stealing and they plan on repaying, you can do that. If you don't plan on repaying, you're not allowed to do it, even to save a life. So how does that fit into the story of dissection? Simple, says Rabbi Ettlinger. If you cannot repay, then you cannot steal. And in the case of a cadaver, it's impossible to repay the dead person, because how do you compensate the deceased for desecrating it? You cannot compensate them. And if you can't compensate them, what did he say? Can't transgress the law. In the words of Rabbi Ettlinger, text 4, page 126, it is stated explicitly that it is forbidden to steal to save a life if one has no intention to repay. In the present case, it is impossible to repay, inasmuch as one cannot compensate the deceased for having been desecrated. It is therefore forbidden to save a life through the desecration of the deceased. So according to Rabbi Ettlinger, if someone steals, they're always able to repay. They may not be able to repay today. They may not be able to repay tomorrow. They may not be able to repay for 5 years, but if they intend on repaying, it's a possibility. In the case of the deceased, it is impossible to repay the deceased for the desecration. And as such, according to Rabbi Ettlinger, in this situation, that he was asked, can we perform an autopsy on the first victim of this disease in order to try and find a cure for victim number 2, who's still alive with the same disease? Says Rabbi Ettlinger, absolutely not. It's theft. And it's worse than theft, because theft you can always repay. And in this case, you cannot repay. And therefore, Rabbi Ettlinger concludes the responsa that it's not allowed. He forbids the autopsy in the case which is presented. So if you analyze this responsa, what do we get? Rabbi Ettlinger seems to be quite extreme. 0 autopsy. You cannot do an autopsy on a cadaver because there's no way to repay the deceased. But there's nuance. And the nuance is, it's only if it's actual theft. What happens if victim number 1, before he died, said, please perform an autopsy on me to find a cure for victim B, or for medical research, or perform an autopsy on me just to practice your autopsy skills? And then the victim dies. According to Rabbi Ettlinger, why does he forbid autopsies? Because it's stealing, which means that if a person gives permission, it's no stealing. No stealing, no problem. Go ahead, perform an autopsy. So according to Rabbi Ettlinger, what do we have? We have an interesting approach. And that is the reason why we're prohibited from performing an autopsy is because it's desecration. But it's only a desecration if the deceased did not give permission, because the desecration is based on theft. If it's not theft, you can perform an autopsy. And therefore, according to Rabbi Ettlinger, whether it's to save a life, or whether it's from medical research, or for any other reason, an autopsy may be performed. And we'll get to various qualifications, even according to Rabbi Ettlinger's pretty extreme lenient opinion. But suffice it to say that this is Rabbi Ettlinger's approach. Now, Rabbi Ettlinger is in the minority. Most disciples of Jewish law do not follow his opinion. They don't agree with his premise. They don't agree with his formula. They disagree on some of the sources that he brings, but it's an approach. But there's a second approach. And the second approach is not based on theft. The second approach before we get to the second approach, I just want to point this out, and that is that if the deceased did not consent, that even in a case to save a life, Rabbi Ettlinger would say it's not permitted to perform an autopsy. So getting back to our case study of the unclaimed bodies, the deceased did not give consent. And if they did not give consent, even if it's to save a life, according to Rabbi Ettlinger, it would be prohibited from using those cadavers for study or for any other reason, and they need to be buried with proper with proper dignity. Now we'll get to the second approach. If the first approach was based on the concept of theft, the second approach is based on sanctity. The second approach is based on an 18th century sage who crystallizes this approach based on various earlier sources as well. His name was Rabbi Yecheskel Landau, a famed decider of Jewish law, famous for various and authoring various volumes on Jewish law that are studied till today in every Jewish house of study, in every yeshiva, and by every rabbi. Every rabbi has his volumes on their shelf and studies them regularly. Rabbi Yecheskel Landau. He was a rabbi in Prague, if I'm not mistaken. He was the rabbi of Prague, and he assumed responsibility, legal responsibility for all of Bohemia in his time in the 18th century. Rabbi Landau's position was that the foundational point of no autopsy is because of the inherent sanctity of the body. Where do we get his position from? Once again, responsa. A question was posed to him from the London Jewish community. Mid-18th century, the London Jewish community sends a question to the preeminent decider of Jewish law of the time, across the channel to Bohemia, to Prague. And the question is, an individual fell ill with a urinary bladder stone. The physicians performed a lithotomy, which is surgery to remove the stone from the bladder, which was pretty customary practice for this particular ailment. And it was an unsuccessful surgery, unfortunately, and tragically, the patient died. So what was the question? The question was, the rabbis of the city of London were asked if it's permitted to dissect this deceased individual in order to learn how to better deal with a similar case should one arise in the future, right? So classic autopsy, perhaps medical dissection by students for studying for the future, I guess, research, not practice, but research. Do we say such a dissection is forbidden because of the desecration of the deceased? Or perhaps is permitted because there's life-saving value. This individual died. But perhaps if they study it and they perform an autopsy and they'll be able to glean much information, perhaps from this information, the physicians will be able to be more careful in the future, and perhaps a lithotomy will not lead to such tragic results. And this question was posed to Rabbi Landau in the middle of the 18th century. It's very similar to the one of Rabbi Ettlinger, but there is an important distinction, and that is there was no patient, no acute situation, no imminent situation that had to be dealt with, as was the case with Rabbi Ettlinger. With Rabbi Ettlinger, there was a second patient involved in the question whose life was at stake at that very moment. In this question, there's no patient. Here it's just for the physicians to study for the future. There will be future cases that arise, but at the moment, there doesn't seem to be one. Now, Rabbi Landau begins with once again quoting the Talmudic passage that we override all mitzvahs in order to save a life. And therefore, one can argue that because dissection of the dead will help medicine make life-saving advantage, therefore the prohibition of desecration should be waived. But just like Rabbi Ettlinger, who first quotes this as well, Rabbi Landau argues as well that this is not the case, but for an entirely different reason than Rabbi Ettlinger. If you recall, Rabbi Ettlinger said it's because of theft. He changed the reasoning, and it has to do with theft and repayment. And if you can't repay, and in the case of the cadaver, he cannot be repaid, and so it has to do with consent. Rabbi Landau took a different approach. Let's have a look in Rabbi Landau's words, text 5 on page 128. It is a clearly established law that we must override the Shabbos laws in our attempt to save a life, even if the chance of success is doubtful. However, this is true only if there is a present threat to life before us, as in the case of an ill person or a collapsed building. But in this case, there is no current patient who would immediately benefit from this dissection. Rather, the physicians want to learn about this surgery because they might, in the future, encounter a patient who will require it. Certainly, we cannot override a prohibition for this lesser concern. For if we were indeed to consider this a case of life and death, it would follow that all forbidden labors on Shabbos would be permitted if they have any medical benefit. Even if no one were currently ill, it would be permitted to grind and cook medicines and prepare a knife for bloodletting because of the mere possibility that during Shabbos or immediately afterward, someone will fall deathly ill and require these things. If we are permissive about dissection, they will dissect all of our dead simply to study anatomy and know how to treat the living. Rabbi Landau says like this, it's true. We violate all of the mitzvahs except for the cardinal 3 to save a life, even for the smallest chance that it will save a life. But this idea of saving a life, it has to be a clear and present danger to life right in front of us, right? Clear and present. Why? Because if not, where do we draw the line? Perhaps everyone should be permitted to take a drive to the beach on Yom Kippur because maybe someone will be drowning in the ocean and I'm going to need to jump in to save their life. And all laws of Shabbos are transgressed. It doesn't work that way. If for whatever reason, a Jew happens to be at the beach and sees someone drowning, then 100% he's got to jump in, save their life, even if it means transgressing multiple Shabbos laws. But under no circumstances is a Jew permitted to get into a car and drive to the beach just in case maybe someone will be drowning. There has to be a clear and present danger to life. And that's where Rabbi Landau draws the line. And so in the London case, we're in a case of stones in the bladder, and a lithotomy was performed unsuccessfully. It was tragic. It's going to happen again. Lithotomies are going to be performed once again, and there's definitely information that can be gleaned. But in this case, there isn't a clear and present danger to life, and as such, says Rabbi Landau, it's forbidden to perform the autopsy. Now, what's the distinction between Rabbi Landau's and Rabbi Ettlinger's case? They both begin with all laws of Shabbos are violated to save a life, and they both end up saying, but in this case, an autopsy is prohibited. But obviously, very, very different reasonings, which lead to a totally different outcome. And there are two important points, perhaps a number of more, but two that we will focus on. The first fundamental difference between Rabbi Landau and Rabbi Ettlinger's position is the consent rule. Do we need to get consent from the individual for do we need to get consent from the individual before we perform an autopsy? According to Rabbi Ettlinger, absolutely. Absolutely. Consent is paramount because it's based on theft, and without consent, even to save a life, it is prohibited. According to Rabbi Landau, if there is a clear and present danger, and that clear and present danger can be saved by performing an autopsy on this individual, then absolutely an autopsy should be performed, because all laws of Shabbat, all laws of the Torah are violated to save a life, and this is clearly saving a life, and we absolutely do not need consent. And an autopsy should be performed. A modern day example would be if they're chasing a murderer. And the only way, perhaps the only way to find the murderer would be to perform an autopsy on the victim of this murder. According to Rabbi Landau, 100%, an autopsy can be performed according to Jewish law on this victim if it will lead, if there's a possibility that it will lead to finding the murder. And why is it clear and present danger? Because the murderer is out there at large. Chances are he's going to go and murder someone else. save a life. And to save a life, we can perform an autopsy. It's clear and present danger. According to Rabbi Etlinger, doesn't matter. No consent, it's theft. Theft without repayment, cannot be performed. But according to Rabbi Landau, we have the flip side, which is, even if there is consent, if there's no clear and present danger, an autopsy cannot be performed because it is desecration of the body. And what's the problem with that? What's desecration? According to Rabbi Landau, what's the idea? Something that we discussed multiple times throughout these lessons. The body does not belong to us. The body is God's body. It's on loan to us. And therefore, we cannot say, but I want to desecrate it. The Torah says the body is sacred. Right? Which is why in the first text that we broke from the Talmud, carrying it on a donkey, you can't be on top of it. You can't have it hanging on the side, right? And right after that, what does the Talmud say? The Talmud says, have a look in text 6a on page 130, just as human bones must be handled respectfully, so must a Torah scroll. The Talmud juxtaposes human bones, human remains with a Torah scroll. And in what way is a human corpse similar to a Torah scroll? The commentaries explain text 6b. Nachmanides points to the sacred names of God that are inked onto a Torah scroll's parchment as an analogy for the sacred soul that is installed within the corporeal body. What happens to a Torah scroll? It's regular parchment. And what's the parchment? It's hides of an animal. The hides of the animal could have been used to make leather coats. It could have been used to make shoes. And then they possess no holiness whatsoever. And as soon as they're done using, you can trash them. But once you take that parchment and you inscribe upon them the words of the Torah, the parchment becomes holy. And even if, God forbid, those letters are ever erased, the parchment is still holy, and it has to be treated with reverence. It has to be treated with respect, and desecration is forbidden. So too, says the Talmud, the human body houses within it the soul. And even when the soul leaves the body, number one, the entirety of the soul doesn't leave. There is still a part of the soul in the body, even after the bulk, if we can say, the bulk of the soul departs the body. There is still a level of soul that is left remaining in the dead body. And even if that were not the case, or reaches a point where that aspect of the soul leaves, which is according to some after decomposition, the body housed the soul. And as such, it was affected by the soul, and it was transformed into a holy entity. And if it's a holy entity, we cannot desecrate it. We cannot desecrate. And if we can't desecrate the human body, then we can't perform an autopsy if it's not necessary to save a life, because it is sacred. Doesn't matter if we consent, doesn't matter if we don't consent, it's not ours to desecrate. And so the Torah says that when it comes to according to Rabbi Landau, which is the majority opinion, which is the opinion followed by most decisors of Jewish law till today, to save a life, we can transgress any law except for the cardinal three, including desecration of the body. And as such, what's Rabbi Landau's approach? If the deceased consented, does that matter? No, doesn't matter. What takes primary importance is, are we saving a life or not? If the autopsy will save a life, not in the future, but it's a clear and present danger, then whether the deceased consented or not, an autopsy may be performed. If it's not to save a life in clear and present danger, even if perhaps it will save a life down the line, An autopsy is prohibited according to Rabbi Landau. But the question is, how do we qualify clear and present danger? What's clear and present danger? According to Rabbi Landau, right? Clear and present danger, then an autopsy may be performed across the board, whether it was consented to or not consented to, because pikuach nefesh, saving a life, takes precedence. And there's a conflict between life and law. Law takes precedence, life takes precedence. Law says that life takes precedence. What would be an example of a case where we'd override the desecration prohibition and say that it's a situation of clear and present danger? Perhaps, let's say, a case of experimental drugs for cancer. There's a controlled test. There are 20 patients, all in the same stage of cancer, and they're being treated with an experimental drug, and one of the patients dies. In such a case, it would be permitted to perform an autopsy to ascertain possible toxicity from this experimental drug, which will forebode potential harm to the other patients who are on the same course of treatment. It's a clear and present danger that this individual's autopsy will provide information for saving these other patients' lives. Another scenario, which would be a clear and present danger, according to Rabbi Landau. There was a convention in Philadelphia in 1976, a war veterans convention, and there were several hundred members of the American Legion that were afflicted with a pneumonia-like illness, and many of these members died. In such a case, Jewish law, according to Rabbi Landau, would allow an autopsy on those who died to discover why they were dying in order to ascertain a treatment to save the lives of the others who were afflicted with this illness, and many who were dying from this illness. And so it's obviously a clear and present danger. Now, when we say clear and present, present doesn't have to mean right here in the same room or right here in the same hospital. That's not what present needs to mean. What present means here is that it's happening at this moment. So if, God forbid, there's a patient in California who dies from this drug program, this experimental drug program for cancer patients, and the other cancer patient is in Sydney, Australia, hey, it's not present. No, that's still considered present, even if they're halfway across the world. It's present because this other patient is taking the same experimental drug, and God forbid they can die. And let's take this and do this autopsy in order to ascertain of how to save that other individual's life. But what about in a case where, right, go back to Rabbi Ettlinger's case. What would Rabbi Landau say? And as I mentioned, that is the majority opinion. What would Rabbi Landau say in a case where, say, appendix, right? Appendix, what's the appendicotomy? I think is appendostomy, pendestomy. I'm not sure how to pronounce it.
Pendectomy.
Thank you. Pendectomy. A pendectomy is a run-of-the-mill surgery. Obviously, like any other surgery, anytime someone goes under the knife, anytime someone goes under, there's risk. But a pendectomy is quite common, right? And thousands of patients undergo a pendectomy. I'm not sure how often. I don't know if it's thousands every month internationally, if it's thousands every year. Either way, it's quite common, and it's a very low level of risk. But perhaps suddenly, from these thousands upon thousands of appendectomies, there's suddenly multiple patients dying. 10, 20. It's not an alarming number, but it's quite alarming for something so usual with low level of risk. And let's say right? That right now there isn't anybody under the knife or going under the knife for an appendectomy, right? And one of these patients who died from the appendectomy is a Jew. Would we be permitted to do an autopsy on this individual to ascertain why suddenly there's 10, 15 patients dying, and it's a 0.5% higher than usually dies under the appendectomies? Would that be permitted or not, according to Rabbi Landau? One might argue that in such a case, Rabbi Landau would forbid it, right? Just as in the case of Rabbi Ettlinger, who forbid it in the, of Rabbi Landau. Earlier, we had the lithotomy, right? What was the reason why it forbid it? Because there's presently no ill person whose life you'll be saving with this dissection. However, there are rabbis within the understanding of Rabbi Landau's approach who would say that in such a case, it would still be permitted. Let's have a look in text 8, page 133. Although the existence of a presently afflicted patient is an obvious instance in which suspension of halachic strictures is warranted, it is by no means the only example. In many outlying settlements in Israel, there is but a single qualified healthcare provider in residence, usually a nurse. Not infrequently, an emergency occurs on Shabbos, and in order to monitor the patient's condition and administer interim medical care, the nurse must accompany the patient in the vehicle transporting the patient to the nearest hospital. During her absence, there is no trained professional qualified to provide emergency care should any other inhabitants become afflicted by illness or suffer an accident. May the nurse ignore Shabbos prohibitions in order to return to her post. The likelihood that a child in any specific family will become afflicted with a life-threatening illness on any given Shabbos is extremely remote. Hence, the mother or the nurse's preparations for that eventuality cannot be categorized as an act of pikuach nefesh. However, when past experience points to a significant likelihood that one person in a large population of individuals will be stricken in such a manner, a number of rabbinic decisors have ruled that the statistical probability of the occurrence of such an event is sufficient to warrant the nurse's return to her post. In effect, present awareness of the statistical probability of impending danger renders the danger itself present in nature. What are we saying? What we're saying here is when we say clear and present danger, according to Rabbi Landau, clear and present doesn't have to be an actual clear and present danger. It can even be a clear and present statistical probability. So in this case for the nurse, if it has happened on average that every Shabbos there is one life-threatening situation, or say two, or 1.5 life-threatening situations, because there is a statistical probability that will happen again on Shabbos, she is permitted, following her transgressing of the laws of Shabbos to bring that patient to the nearby hospital, she's now permitted to get back into her car and drive back to her post. But what do you mean there's no clear and present danger? Statistical probability is considered present in nature. And because statistical probability is that there will be another life-threatening situation under her watch, and she has to be there to help that situation, she's permitted to transgress the laws of Shabbos to get back to her post because of that statistical probability. And therefore, getting back to our case, because appendicitis is such a common problem, and appendectomy is the common solution, and now in this hypothetical situation, there were appendectomies that were going wrong. Because they're at the current moment, there is a statistical probability that it will happen again with a pretty, what's the word I'm looking for? It's going to happen pretty soon. we can say that that is a clear and present danger because there is a statistical probability. And as such, according to Rabbi Landau, that would be considered a clear and present danger, and it's no problem. You can go ahead and do an autopsy on that individual in order to gain information for this clear and present danger of a statistical probability. So we're slowly getting a picture of what the Jewish perspective is in Jewish law regarding autopsies. According to both rabbis, Rabbi Ettlinger and Rabbi Landau, the prohibition of desecration will forbid post-mortem autopsies in some cases. According to both, they prohibit it. According to Rabbi Ettlinger, the prohibition will pertain if there's no consent. According to Rabbi Landau, the prohibition will pertain when there is no present threat to life. But even when the circumstances would be that both rabbis would forbid a autopsy, they may permit post-mortem procedures that do not constitute desecration of the dead. For example, a biopsy on the body. A biopsy on the body. Would a biopsy, according to Jewish law, is a biopsy on the body or a post-mortem blood test, are those permitted or prohibited? Do they fall under the same guidelines of a classical autopsy, or is there a difference? Let's have a look. Text 9, page 135. This is from a decider of Jewish law, a contemporary decider of Jewish law passed in 1986, Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, who we're quite familiar with. We've quoted him, I believe, in all 3 prior classes. In my opinion, he says, it would not constitute a violation of desecration if physicians will not cut open the limbs, neck, or torso that only seek to perform a needle biopsy in order to obtain fluid for diagnostic analysis and evaluation. It is not a form of desecration, and it is permissible because it is very common to do such procedures on the living. Likewise, removing blood by a needle and syringe for analysis does not constitute desecration and is permitted. Although I have not found this stated explicitly in earlier sources, it seems clear to me that this is true. And similarly, intubation, because intubation is a common practice for living people, and it's a common practice which is not considered desecration. It may be uncomfortable, it may be, but it's not desecration. Intubation, for whatever reason, for example, for students and doctors to practice on a cadaver, to practice intubation, seemingly it would be permitted, and it is not considered desecration. And the rabbis qualify that, generally speaking, if we're talking about a standard, non-invasive, relatively minor procedure that living people agree to do regularly, to do that on the dead is not prohibited and is not considered desecration. So that, a biopsy, a colonoscopy, endoscopy, laparoscopies, however you pronounce it, these types of procedures or non-invasive procedures do not constitute desecration, versus something which is invasive, a procedure which is done on a living in order to heal them, a surgery, things like that, cutting open, those things are not permitted if to be performed on the dead, unless it's to save a life, according to Landau, or unless it was clear consent was given, according to Rabbi Ettlinger. But there is one other point, and another point that is, there's a recent development in postmortem research that is very relevant to the discussion, and it would definitely not be considered nivell, desecration, and the Jewish community should and is promoting further work in this field and the use of these methods whenever possible. And that is what's called I think it's a virtopsy, which is a virtual autopsy. Now, have a look at text 10, page 136. Post-mortem MRI is a potential diagnostic alternative to conventional autopsy. but few large prospective studies have compared its accuracy with that of conventional autopsy. We assess the accuracy of whole body postmortem MRI for detection of major pathological lesions associated with deaths in a prospective cohort of fetuses and children. Minimally invasive autopsy has accuracy similar to that of conventional autopsy for detection of cause and death or major pathological abnormality after death in fetuses, newborns, and infants, but was less accurate in older children. If undertaken jointly by pathologists and radiologists, minimally invasive autopsy could be an acceptable alternative to conventional autopsy in selected cases. Now, it's clear, currently, they are inferior to classic autopsies, but nonetheless, virtual autopsies, is obviously much better, especially from a Jewish perspective. If it can gain some information, then do that. There is no desecration whatsoever. In any case, even in a case when, according to Rabbi Landau and according to Rabbi Ettlinger, and their each respective permissibilities, when they say that it's permissible to perform an autopsy, in any case, the cadaver still has to be treated with utmost respect. There's a whole litany of Jewish laws pertaining to dealing with the deceased after their passing, and during an even permissible and necessary obligatory autopsy, these laws still have to be followed. No eating, drinking, casual conversation is allowed in the presence of the dead body. That still pertains when performing an autopsy. According to Jewish law, people are not allowed to turn their backs on a dead body. The dead body is not allowed to be lied face down. It has to be covered at all possible times. And if an autopsy is being performed on one area, the other areas must be covered at all times. And according to Jewish law, a dead body is never allowed to be left alone. Someone has to be with it at all times, because if we leave it alone, we may be showing, it may imply that the corpse has no value. And therefore, we have to go out of our way to stress that the opposite is true. And so it's called a shomer, where a dead body always has a guard standing nearby. According to Jewish law, someone has to be there at all times guarding it. It's not a guard worried about, grave diggers, grave thieves. It's an honor guard. And so all these laws still have to be respected in a case of permissible, even in a case of permissible autopsies. Which leads us to a second halachic issue, which is raised by the use of cadavers in medical research, and that is the Jewish laws of burial. You see, the problem is when it comes to utilizing cadavers, dead bodies, even in a permissible case, even in a case where Rabbi Ettlinger would say it's permissible to use a cadaver, there's a second issue. And that issue is, according to Jewish law, bodies must be buried. When we say bodies, we mean every single aspect of the person, which is part of them when they die, must be buried. Their blood, their bones, their tissue, their flesh, their skin, every single aspect of the body has to be buried. And so even in a case, right, where there are post-mortem procedures that are permitted and they don't constitute an aspect of nivel, of desecration, we would still have to deal with the halachic issue of burial. According to Jewish law, burial is not just a pragmatic thing that we don't want to complicate the process of healing, or it's a disgrace to the dignity of the person, it's going to threaten health and hygiene. That's not the reason why we bury. If that was the reason, burial at sea would be permitted, cremation, God forbid, would be permitted, interment in a vault would be permitted, but it's not. All the above are prohibited. Why? According to Jewish law, we see a tremendous focus on burial throughout the generations. Abraham went at great lengths to bury Sarah. It also tells us that God went at great lengths to make sure that Moses was buried. The 12 tribes were carried throughout the desert throughout the 40 years to bring them to Israel, to bury them in proper Jewish burial in Egypt. And furthermore, we have a commandment to bury our dead. As Maimonides codifies in Jewish law, text 11, page 137, if the deceased had instructed that they not be buried after the death, we do not obey, says Maimonides, because we are commanded to bury our dead. As the verse states, you shall bury them on that same day. So on the day that a person passes, Jewish law stipulates that they must be buried. Burying in the ground is God's immutable decree. And even if the deceased had wishes to the contrary, where in other areas we're actually obligated in following the wishes of the deceased, when it comes to Jewish law, we do not follow the wishes of the deceased. The premise of this mitzvah, aside from it just being a mitzvah, because that's what it says in the Torah, is the idea that we are merely custodians of our bodies. A human being is just the custodian of their body. And therefore, where did the body come from? The verse tells us that God scooped up some earth, right? And made Adam. And what does God tell Adam? Have a look in text 12, page 138. For you were made from dust, and to dust you will return. The human body was created from the earth, and our bodies are handed to us as a deposit. Upon that, the deposit must be returned to the earth from where it was taken from burial. And so the mitzvah of burial applies to the entire body. What happens when an autopsy is performed? It would result in part of the body not being buried. And even in a case which is a permitted autopsy, so we don't have the issue of desecration, it would still be halachically problematic. And that is why some sages prohibited dissection for medical training simply because it won't get proper Jewish burial. Have a look in text 13, page 139. Even those opinions that tend to be more lenient regarding the question of desecrating the dead would agree that there is no permission to provide bodies to the medical schools in Poland. We have done an investigation into the protocols of the prosectarium and have learned that many of the limbs of bodies donated to these medical schools are never buried. Some are scalded, some are stored in containers, and some are branded with numerals. The Jerusalem Talmud states when the Torah commands bury them, it is instructing us to bury the entire corpse. This informs us that if part of the body is left unburied, it is as if no burial has occurred. And what happens? Which leads us to another issue with autopsies, even permissible autopsies. And that is, burial must take place promptly, because if burial does not take place promptly, that in itself is desecration. And not only is desecration, the soul is unsettled. The soul is unsettled until its entirety is buried, which is one of the reasons why we rush to bury. According to Jewish law, as we mentioned earlier, burial has to happen the same day of passing. Text 14, page 140. The dust returns to the earth as it was at the start of creation, and the spirit returns to God who gave it. When does the spirit return to God who gave it? When the dust returns to the earth as it was. When is the soul at rest? When does the soul return to God? When the dust returns to the earth. When the body is buried, when the entirety of the body is buried. The soul wants to see its mission through. As long as its body isn't buried, the soul will not go to heaven because it wants to see its mission through the end, which is the body being buried, a proper Jewish burial. And as such, it's not at rest. God forbid if an autopsy, which isn't necessary, is performed. And even if it's necessary, is performed, but it's not treated the way it should be, according to Jewish law, with every aspect of the body then being buried properly, and it being done as quickly as possible, following only what's absolutely necessary, the body will, God forbid, never be at rest. The soul will never be at rest. The final accomplishment that a person has in this world is Jewish burial. And as long as that happens, the soul is not at rest. In order to allow the soul to return to its source, we need to allow burial to happen right away. And so even if desecration is not an issue, performing an autopsy, will that delay the burial? If it'll delay the burial, The soul's not at rest, going against that law. Now, if it's in for to save a life, then everyone would agree that even that is suspended. We don't look at if it's going to take extra time. But even then, if it's to save a life, it has to be done in a case where every aspect of the body will now be buried properly according to Jewish law, and will be done as soon as possible. But generally speaking, the burial must take place right away. And therefore, when it comes to autopsies or cadavers which are used for medical research and training, they're generally used for extended periods of time. And even if they're buried, very little remains of them, which opens up a whole slew of other questions pertaining to Jewish law. So just to sum up this part before we get to a few points on organ donation. Postmortem procedures, primarily autopsy, is prohibited according to Jewish law because of desecration to the body. According to Rabbi Ettlinger, we do have exceptions, and that is when there is consent. According to Rabbi Landau, consent does not make it or break it. It doesn't matter if we have consent. There has to be a clear and present danger. And we said even a statistical probability is considered a clear and present danger. If there's no clear and present danger, even with consent, it is prohibited because the body is holy, has to be treated as such, and therefore we're not allowed to play around with it. And we cannot give consent for it. Even if it's a situation where it is permitted and we say there is no desecration, we still have the two issues of burying the full body, every aspect of the body, which complicates issues when there are autopsies, and secondly, of a immediate burial as soon as possible for the honor of the deceased, and that also gets complicated with postmortem procedures. And therefore, those issues are all taken into consideration by rabbis who come when these questions are presented. Unfortunately, in many instances, there are things are taken out of proportion. Things are autopsies are performed where it's not absolutely necessary. There are ways to go around them. There was a situation in 2011 where the local Chabad rabbi in Washington State was heavily involved. There was a hiker who died from cardiac arrest and hypothermia. It was very clear, but he had a few bruises, and so the state wanted to perform an autopsy. This is a story from 2011. You can check it up online. His name is Brian Grobais. And it was clear. The doctors, the first responders, everyone was in unison agreed that the reason for his death, the cause of death, was hypothermia and cardiac arrest. But the state still wanted to perform an autopsy because there were some bruises, and they wanted to rule out, homicide. The obvious issue was that these bruises were clearly from the fall that this climber had after his hypothermia and cardiac arrest, cardiac arrest and hypothermia. And it was clear that that was what the bruises were for. And Chabad successfully fought the case. It went to, if I'm not mistaken, the Supreme Court of the state of Washington. I don't remember all the details of the case. This is 13 years ago. But Chabad won the case that no autopsy should be performed, and he had a proper Jewish burial. He was returned to his family. It was actually from the East Coast, if I'm not mistaken. I don't recall all the details of the case. I should have checked it up before the class. Either way, in other words, this is just one case, but it does happen quite often where autopsies are performed because why not? And clearly we see that that is not the permissible case according to Jewish law. Interestingly enough, as a result of these issues, states are slowly but surely making rules against autopsies, are making laws to ensure that unwanted and unnecessary autopsies aren't performed. And here's an example of New York State version of the law. There are 10 states that have these types of laws, and it's growing. Let's have a look on text 15 on page 141. This is from the law of New York State. In the absence of a compelling public necessity, no dissection or autopsy shall be performed over the objection of a surviving relative or friend of the deceased that such procedure is contrary to the religious belief of the decedent, or if there is otherwise reason to believe that a dissection or autopsy is contrary to the decedent's religious beliefs. Compelling public necessity, right? Everything has to be qualified, shall mean, one, that the dissection or autopsy is essential to the conduct of a criminal investigation of a homicide of which the decedent is the victim, right? So clearly, almost like a halachic scenario. Or two, that discovery of the cause of death is necessary to meet an immediate and substantial threat to the public health, and that a dissection or autopsy is essential to ascertain the cause of death. Almost like they looked at Rabbi Landau's opinion and then wrote this law, right? An immediate and substantial threat. All dissections or autopsies performed pursuant to this section shall be the last intrusive procedure consistent with the least intrusive procedure consistent with the compelling state interest. As we mentioned earlier, the virtual autopsy, the virtopsy, that obviously this would be a viable alternative to alleviate the tension between Jewish law and the autopsy requirements. And so returning to our case study, should unclaimed bodies be allowed for use for anatomical dissection? And we'll have the clear answer. According to Rabbi Atlinger, absolutely not. There's no consent, not allowed. It's done. It's desecration, and they have to be buried. According to Rabbi Landau, you cannot use these unclaimed bodies for anatomical dissection if it's just for medical training, because medical training does not qualify as clear and present danger. However, if there is a clear and present danger, then definitely we can use these bodies for an autopsy for a clear and present danger. But we had the 2 points, which is we have to bury the dead as soon as possible. And on the contrary, when it comes to unclaimed bodies, according to Jewish law, unclaimed bodies is actually perhaps worse than other situations. It's more severe. Unclaimed bodies is called a mes mitzvah, which is a dead person of a mitzvah. What does that mean? It means that in a case of a dead person who's found an unclaimed body, literally textbook case of unclaimed body, someone's walking on the road and they see a body, and the body right now is a situation where the body has to be treated with utmost respect. Even a priest who's prohibited from coming in contact with a body, even a high priest, if there's no one else to take care of it, the high priest is obligated to become impure to take care and give respect to that body. So in the case where there's an unclaimed body, there's no next of kin, or no one wants to take responsibility. On the contrary, the state has a responsibility to treat that body with perhaps more respect than it would treat other bodies, precisely because it is unclaimed and it has to be given proper burial. Now, a few words on, I know we're going a little bit over time, but a few words on organ donation. When it comes to organ donation, there's a couple of issues, and there's no slides for this one, so I'll stop this for a moment. When it comes to organ donation, there's a number of issues. Do you see the screen flickering, or is that just me? Anyone, can someone tell me if the screen is flickering for you as well?
Not flickering.
Sorry?
I don't see a flickering.
Okay, that's good, because my screen is flickering as if it's going through the washing machine. So when it comes to organ donation, it works as follows. There's a couple of issues that has to be dealt with when it comes to organ donation. Right? The first is desecration of the body, which is an issue that we studied, that we analyzed the various perspectives. And perhaps when it comes to desecration, we can say it's to save a life. Organ donation is to save a life. In the case where it's saving a life, right, where it's an organ that's going to save a life of someone else, and perhaps it's not considered desecration. Then there's the question of needing to bury the body in its entirety. Another issue, right? If someone donates an organ, their body's not being buried in its entirety. Another issue that needs to be analyzed is something called hanoas hames, deriving benefit from a corpse. If you look at text 17 on page 150, here's from Maimonides. It is forbidden to derive benefit from any part of the dead. One may, however, derive benefit from the hair because it is not considered part of the body. It is also forbidden to derive benefit from the coffin or any of the shrouds. Now, how can you derive benefit from corpse? Up until really the 18th century, there was something called mumia. Mumia was a substance made from dug up ancient Egyptian mummies, hence its name, mumia. And it was prescribed as a drug for various ailments, from liver disorders to bone fractures, and really a host of other things. It really stemmed from, it was a substance that was treated, what was used to cover the bodies, but it ended up unfortunately using the actual bodies being ground up, and then obviously it turns out it was quackery, or to the best of their knowledge at the time they thought it was good medicine, but turns out it wasn't beneficial. But at the time, Jews were having that same issue: can they use this medication, which was claimed to have medicinal benefits? And there's a host of conversations regarding that within Jewish medical ethicists at the time, sages and rabbis. And there was one contemporary decisor of Jewish law, Zimmer's Rabbi Mordechai Alevi, who ruled that it is prohibited. Why? Because it's benefiting from the dead. Yet we mentioned earlier that saving a life takes precedence, right? And so therefore, when it comes to life-saving organ transplants, there is a major halachic conversation, every aspect of it, but the consensus is that if it's a life-saving is the key. So not organ saving or limb saving. A life-saving organ transplant would override the prohibitions against desecration and override the prohibition against benefiting from a corpse, as well as it would override the mitzvah of burying the entire body. The problem is, for most vital organ donations, there's a more serious problem, and that is, what is the definition of death? Vital organs, the brain, the heart, the liver, can only be harvested while the donor's heart is still beating. While modern medicine has adopted a definition of death, for the most part, of brain death, according to Jewish law, it isn't that case. There's been a lot written on this, and if you want some more material on it, on the definition of death according to Jewish law, is a brain death, is the heart stopping. But generally speaking, the heart has to stop, according to Jewish law, for it to be considered dead. And as such, like we discussed 2 weeks ago, as long as that doesn't happen, the person is still alive, and causing that to happen is considered murder, which means that liver transplant, heart transplant, according to Jewish law, is prohibited because it's murder. It's not possible. You cannot have a dead heart that's not beating anymore, and liver, which isn't coming from a person who has their heart beating, have a liver transplant, because it's has to come from a live body. And therefore, most halachic authorities do not accept cessation of brain activity as death, and therefore, as long as the heart is still functioning, they consider the person alive. Removal of vital organs from such a person is considered by most authorities as an actual act of murder and not organ donation. There's lots of discussions on this. It's beyond the scope of this class, but I wanted to mention, when it comes to transplants after death, right? Death by any definition, the heart stopped, the brain ceased to work, the person is dead by all accounts. Now, how about organ transplantation at that point? For example, cornea transplant, right? Take the cornea from a dead person, and use it to restore vision to a person with a damaged cornea. We're not going to read the ruling that's quoted here on text 18. It's a little long. You can read it. It's fascinating. He comes up with some very unique arguments, which really gives us insight into how a Jewish law tries to, come up with various ideas and fascinating derivations. But suffice it to say that this is Rabbi Unterman, who is a Israeli rabbi who presents the idea that it's obvious that it's permitted across the board. Cornea transplant, any sort of post-mortem, after the heart stops, the brain stops, after everything stops, it's no problem. You can do a transplant. The problem is it's not across the board. And there are various rabbis who say differently than him. We just presented this one because he goes into very interesting ideas about it. His theory doesn't adequately address all the issues that we have. We also have the idea about consent. Can a person consent? In other words, here it's not to save a life. If it's not to save a life, according to Rabbi Landau, perhaps it would be absolutely prohibited from donating an organ post-mortem. When it comes to something like skin donation, which in certain situations, donating skin may be actually life-saving, then perhaps, according to Rabbi Landau, it would be an obligation to perform that organ donation, to donate skin from a deceased, even if they don't have it on their card to donate organ. There are others that argue not, and it's a dispute amongst the sages. There was one more point I wanted to mention about that, and it is evading me at the moment. Now, when it comes to organ donation, there's one area where not only is it not prohibited, but it's encouraged, and that is organ donation, a living organ donor. Prime examples is kidney donation and bone marrow. Bone marrow and kidney donation are living organ donations, and not only permitted according to Jewish law, encouraged, so much so that in the United States, voluntary kidney donations, amongst 18% of voluntary kidney donations is from the Orthodox Jewish community. 18%. The Jewish community is a fraction of a percent of the population in the United States. The Orthodox Jewish community is a fraction of that. And yet 18% of all kidney donations in the United States comes from the Orthodox Jewish community. So it's an interesting 18%, here's the language of the study. 80% of all altruistic kidney donations in the US are by Orthodox Jews, which is a wild statistic and shows us how, in other words, when it's permitted, according to Jewish law goes all the way. And people, I know, I have friends who've donated kidneys. There's Jewish registries, there's people, and they do it all the time. It happens every single day. There are people donating kidneys. I know many people who donated a kidney to someone they've never met before in their life. They were called, there's the same idea for bone marrow transplant. It's a little less invasive, perhaps. It has its risks, but bone marrow transplant is also, it's a pretty high percentage. I'm on a bone marrow registry. Most of my friends are on the bone marrow registry. And I know many friends who've donated bone marrow transplants for people they've never met. They go into registry and they get a call one day. You match. Would you like to? And usually the response is overwhelming. So 18% of altruistic kidney donations in the United States are by Orthodox Jews. Even more than that, Israel has the highest number of altruistic kidney donors in the world. Think about that. Israel, such a small country, has the highest number of altruistic kidney donors in the entire world, and most of that comes from Orthodox Jews, which shows us how strong the Orthodox tradition is, the Torah tradition is, when it comes to saving a life, doing what we can within the parameters and the framework of Jewish law. We go to the fullest extent. Just to conclude, God willing, with the coming of Mashiach, may it be speedily in our days, all of these rules will be rendered obsolete because we will have the resurrection of the dead. Everyone will come back in good health and happiness. May it happen speedily in our days. Amen.
Right.